Okay, so let's talk about reciprocal versus inverse. So first thing is, what's a reciprocal? So two expressions, or they could be functions, are related in such a way that their product is 1. So if you multiply two things together and the result is a 1, then that's an actual reciprocal. So this means this, right? So a times b equals 1. So notice I can divide through by b. I get a equals 1 over b, and I can represent 1 over b as b to the negative 1. Okay, so if you need a little review, watch the video on negative exponents to see why 1 over b actually equals b to the negative 1. The point of this, though, is to note that now I have this negative exponent indicates that it's a reciprocal, right? So I can use this negative 1 as a power, as an exponent, to mean reciprocal, right? Which is kind of nice, handy. Well, let me ask you this then. Let's look at sine to the negative 1 of 1/2. So now what I'm saying is we just learned that negative 1s represent reciprocals. So the question is this a reciprocal? Well, if this is a reciprocal, right, then that means that sine to the negative 1 of 1/2 times sine of 1/2 equals 1, right? So if that's true, then this is a reciprocal. Well, is this true? Well, inverse sine of 1/2 is 30 degrees. Sine of 1/2 is 0.0087, and I left my calculator in degrees. So, but clearly, even if this were in radians, this is not 1, right? So we just figured out that unfortunately negative 1 can be represented, can represent a reciprocal. There are also other instances where negative 1 is not a reciprocal, right? So that's the confusing part. All right, so we know this can't be a reciprocal, right? For the reason we just showed, because you don't multiply it together and get 1, right? And the other reason is this is not multiplication. This was never sine to the negative 1 times 1/2. So that's the part you need to kind of take away. Reciprocals come from multiplication, right? What I'm going to show you here comes from kind of functions, kind of a process, or functions of things, all right? Okay, so that's the takeaway, the first part. Reciprocals come from multiplication. If it's not multiplication, then this little sign does not mean reciprocal, all right? Okay, so now that is the question. What is sine to the negative 1? We know it's not a reciprocal. Well, let's see this. So an inverse is a function that undoes the action of another function, all right? So these aren't functions here. This is just an inverse operation. So if I have x plus 3, the inverse is minus 3, right? So x plus 3 minus 3, I'm left with just my x. So that's an example of an inverse operation. What's the inverse of multiplication? Division. So 3 times x, divide by 3, I'll get an x. All right. A function-wise is something like this. A square root and a square. A square is the inverse operation of a square root, because when I square a square root, I get x. And I could have also done square root of x squared to get an x, all right? But notice what's happening. I'm undoing some stuff. So here, the square undoes the square root. Here, the division undoes the multiplication. Here, the subtraction undoes the addition. That's an inverse, all right? So if this sine of negative 1 is not a reciprocal, what is it? It's an inverse. So in fact, sine of negative 1, or sine to the negative 1, of sine of x equals x. So you can see, and none of this is multiplication. So it's sine negative 1, so it's the inverse sine is what we call it because it's an inverse, of sine of x equals x. All right? Okay, so now it gets weird, right? So sometimes the negative 1 as an exponent means reciprocal, and that's only in multiplication cases. And the other times it means inverse. So those are the times when it's not multiplication. All right, so that's the take home here. All right, so when you have a times b to the negative 1, it's a reciprocal because it's a multiplication case. When you have, well, we could also represent it as b to the negative 1 is this reciprocal, right? Is the 1 over b. Okay, when we have not multiplication, so functions, so inverse sine of 1/2, sine is a function of this ratio, right? This is not sine times, then that's an inverse, all right? And so we can see inverse sine of 1/2 in degree mode is 30 degrees, all right? So that's the difference. If it's a multiplication context, it's a reciprocal. If it's a function context, then it's an inverse.